It was a quiet morning when George, a 90-year-old veteran, stepped out of his small home. He'd been living in the same neighborhood for decades now, ever since he returned from the war. He had seen it all, times of joy, moments of hardship, and a long stretch of peace after the battles were over. But today, there was something different in the air. George wasn't a man who went out much anymore. Age had slowed him down, and his legs ached more than they used to. But this morning, he decided to go for a short walk. It was his usual routine, just a slow stroll around the block to get some fresh air, nothing more. He adjusted the old cap on his head, the one he wore everywhere, his badge of honor, a reminder of the days he'd spent fighting for his country. As he walked down the sidewalk, he passed familiar houses, the ones that had been there for years. But today, there was an unfamiliar sound in the distance. The roar of motorcycle engines grew louder, and before he knew it, a group of bikers came speeding down the street. They were young, loud, and reckless. The noise they made was almost unbearable, and the speed at which they rode made George nervous. He stepped to the side of the road, trying to stay out of their way. He wasn't in a hurry, and his slow pace made it easy for him to step aside. But the bikers didn't seem to care. One of them, a tall guy with a dark leather jacket, revved his engine and zoomed past George, kicking up dust and gravel from the street. George coughed, trying to avoid the cloud of dirt. He wasn't used to this kind of disruption. The bikers were causing trouble all over the neighborhood, zooming through streets, revving their engines late at night, and being generally disrespectful to anyone in their path. But George had seen worse in his time. He didn't let it bother him too much. But then, one of them, a young man with tattoos all over his arms, slowed down and pulled up next to George. He looked at him with a sneer. "Hey, old man," the biker called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "You still alive, huh? Thought you'd be long gone by now." George looked up, surprised by the rude words. His hand instinctively gripped the old walking stick he carried with him. He wasn't one to get into confrontations, especially not with someone so much younger. But the way the biker spoke, it wasn't just disrespectful, it was cruel. "Just taking a walk," George said calmly, trying to keep his voice steady. The biker chuckled, revving his engine again. "A walk? What, you got nowhere else to be? Probably just waiting to die, huh?" George could feel the sting of the words, but he didn't show it. He'd faced worse insults during his time in the war, and he knew how to keep his emotions in check. But as the biker sped off, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. This wasn't just some careless teasing, it felt personal, and it hurt more than it should have. As the biker's engine faded into the distance, George turned and walked back toward his house. His steps were slower now, his heart a little heavier than before. He didn't know why, but the words of that young man lingered in his mind. It wasn't just the insults. It was the disrespect, the way people had changed over the years. Back when George was young, respect for your elders was a given, but now it seemed like respect was a rare thing. He sighed and made his way home, not knowing that the world around him was about to change in a way he could never have imagined. The rest of the day passed quietly, but George couldn't shake the feeling from that morning. As he sat in his old, creaky armchair, staring out the window, the sounds of the neighborhood felt distant, as though he was hearing them from another time. The bikers' laughter, the loud engines, it all felt like an intrusion in a world that used to be simpler. But George didn't spend much time dwelling on things. He'd learned long ago that the best way to face difficulties was to keep moving forward. He made himself some tea, sat back, and let the warmth of the cup fill his hands. But the sting of that young man's words was still there. He had been alone for a long time. His wife, Mary, passed away a few years ago, and since then, his only company was his memories, and sometimes his old war buddy, Jack, who'd call him once in a while. Jack had been his closest friend since the war, a bond formed through shared battles and experiences that no one else could understand. Jack was one of the few people who truly got George. George hadn't heard from Jack in a few months, but something told him today was the day. Maybe it was the way the weight of the past seemed to be pressing down on him, or maybe it was just a feeling he had. Either way, George picked up the phone and dialed Jack's number. The phone rang a few times before Jack picked up. "George?" Is that you?" Jack's voice sounded hoarse, like he hadn't spoken in a while. "It's me, Jack. Been a while." Jack chuckled softly. "A little too long, old friend. What's going on with you? You sound like something's bothering you." George hesitated, staring out the window, thinking about the bikers and their disrespectful words. Just had a run-in with some of the younger guys around here," George said, his voice carrying the weight of the frustration he felt. "They were disrespectful, mocking me for no reason. It's not like it used to be, Jack. People have changed." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Jack spoke with a sigh. "You know, George, you don't have to put up with that. Not anymore." George was quiet. He hadn't expected that. "What do you mean?" Jack's voice grew serious. "You've got connections, George. People you fought with, people who would stand by you if you called on them. You're not alone in this, and you don't have to let anyone push you around. You've earned respect. You've earned more than that. I think it's time to remind them." George sat up straight, his heart starting to race. Jack's words hit him like a jolt of electricity, sparking something inside of him. "What are you suggesting?" "There's a lot of people from the old days still around," Jack said, his tone firm. "You just have to make the call. I'll make sure you're taken care of. They'll listen to you, George. You don't have to take this disrespect from anyone, especially not those punks." The idea seemed crazy to George at first. He wasn't the kind of man who'd go around seeking revenge or stirring up trouble. But something about the way Jack spoke, the promise in his voice, made him reconsider. Maybe Jack was right. Maybe it was time to stop being a bystander and start standing up for himself. George slowly set his cup of tea down, his fingers trembling slightly. "All right," he said, his voice steady. "Make the call. Let's see who's still out there." Jack didn't waste any time. He hung up the phone and immediately started making arrangements. Meanwhile, George couldn't help but wonder what was about to happen. He had no idea how things would unfold, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a spark of hope. Maybe it wasn't too late to get some respect back. The sun was starting to dip behind the horizon when George received a call from Jack. His hand shook slightly as he picked up the phone, not knowing what to expect. He'd spent his whole life avoiding trouble, keeping to himself. But today, Jack had made him feel like there was something bigger waiting for him. "All right, George," Jack said on the other end. His voice was calm, but there was a certain urgency to it. "I've made the call. You'll know when they're here." George wasn't sure who they were, but he trusted Jack. The man had never steered him wrong before. He hung up the phone and sat in his chair, staring out the window again. The neighborhood seemed so peaceful, so ordinary. How could something so big be about to happen right here? About an hour later, the sound of engines began to rumble in the distance. It started low, barely noticeable, but it grew louder, like the storm clouds rolling in. George's heart began to race. Was this really happening? He opened his front door slowly and stepped outside onto the porch. The evening air was cool, and the streetlights flickered on one by one. The sound of the motorcycles grew louder still, until the first bike appeared at the end of the street. A tall, muscular man, dressed in black leather, was riding toward George's house. George's breath caught in his throat. He wasn't sure what to expect, but this wasn't it. The biker wasn't just a young punk. He looked older, harder, and there was something commanding about the way he carried himself. He didn't slow down as he reached George's house. No, he revved his engine, making the ground shake beneath George's feet. The biker pulled up to the curb and cut the engine, the sudden silence making George's heart pound in his chest. The man took off his helmet, revealing a shaved head and a scar running down the side of his face. His eyes locked onto George's with an intensity that made the older man's knees tremble. "You, George?" the biker asked, his voice gravelly but respectful. George nodded, unsure of what was happening. "Yeah, I'm George. Can I help you?" The biker didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Jack sent me," he said, and George felt a jolt of recognition. This wasn't just some random biker. This was someone who had been in Jack's circle. Someone who owed Jack favors. And in George's time, favors were a bond stronger than blood. Before George could speak, the biker motioned to the group of riders who had slowly started pulling up behind him. They weren't the same bikers who had mocked him earlier. No, these men were different. They were older, grizzled, their faces marked by years of hard living, but there was something in the way they held themselves that made George feel a sense of power. A power that hadn't been there before. "We've got your back, old man," the biker said, stepping closer. "Those punks who disrespected you? They won't be a problem anymore." George swallowed hard, trying to make sense of it all. He was overwhelmed. This wasn't something he had ever imagined. His life hadn't exactly been filled with excitement in recent years. But now, as he stood in front of these men, he felt the power of the moment. It was as if something deep inside him had been reawakened. The biker handed George a thick leather jacket, much like the one he had worn in his younger days, before life had slowed him down. "Wear this," the biker said. "You've earned it." George took the jacket, feeling the weight of it in his hands. He didn't know what was going to happen next, but for the first time in years, he felt alive. Not just alive, but important. He wasn't the old man walking alone anymore. He was part of something bigger. "All right," George said, his voice steadier now, stronger. "Let's take care of this." The biker smiled. "That's the spirit, George. Let's remind them who they're messing with." And with that, George, along with Jack's crew of bikers, revved their engines and set off toward the street where the disrespectful group of young bikers had made their mark earlier that morning. The roar of the engines echoed down the street as George and his newfound allies cruised through the neighborhood. The wind rushed past him, and for a moment, George felt like he was back in the days when he was young, alive with energy and purpose. The familiar weight of the leather jacket on his shoulders gave him a sense of power he hadn't felt in years. The street was quiet when they arrived, but George knew that the bikers who had mocked him earlier were somewhere nearby. He could feel the tension in the air, like the calm before a storm. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he had the oddest sense of peace, as if Jack's call had set everything in motion, and now there was no turning back. As they rolled down the street, George's eyes scanned the familiar houses. Everything looked the same, but he felt different, like he had stepped into a new chapter of his life. It wasn't just about the young punks or the disrespect. It was about reclaiming something he thought had been lost: his dignity, his voice, and maybe even his confidence. Finally, they spotted the group of bikers at the corner. The young man who had mocked George earlier was standing in front of a gas station, laughing with his friends. He hadn't noticed the approaching riders yet. The biker who had accompanied George, the one with the scarred face, revved his engine loudly, sending a jolt of noise through the air. The young bikers turned, their faces frozen with surprise, as they saw the group coming toward them. One of them, a lanky guy with piercings all over his face, stepped forward, his grin quickly fading when he saw the serious faces of the older bikers. "What the hell is this?" he shouted, trying to sound tough, but there was a nervous edge to his voice. The tall biker with the scarred face stopped in front of the group. "We're here to talk," he said, his voice calm but heavy with authority. "You've been disrespecting an old man, and I don't take kindly to that." The young man who had insulted George earlier stepped forward, his face flushed with arrogance. "You think we're scared of you, old man?" he sneered, pointing a finger at the biker with the scar. "We don't answer to anyone, especially not you." That's when George's heart skipped a beat. It was his turn. He had to speak up. The words had been sitting in his chest all day, waiting for the right moment. "Actually," George said, his voice steady and strong, "you do answer to me, and you'll show respect, or you'll regret it." The young man's eyes widened, and for a moment, he looked like he didn't believe what he was hearing. He sneered, ready to say something, but before he could open his mouth, one of the other bikers, a gruff-looking man with a beard, stepped forward and grabbed him by the collar. "You don't talk to him like that," the man said, his voice low and menacing. "This is George, and you're lucky he's giving you a chance." The young man's cocky expression faltered, but he tried to stand his ground. "I don't know who the hell you think you are, but..." Before he could finish, George stepped closer, his voice firm. "I'm a man who fought for this country. I've earned my place here, and I've earned the right to be treated with respect. Now, I suggest you think carefully about how you act from now on." The biker who had mocked George earlier stood frozen, his bravado crumbling in the face of George's unwavering gaze. The rest of the group, watching from a distance, was silent, waiting for something to happen. George didn't back down. He'd seen enough. His patience had been tested for too long, and now he was reclaiming his dignity, his honor. The young man finally lowered his head, his pride broken. He muttered something under his breath, but the respect was there now. He had no choice but to accept it. The tall biker with the scar nodded in approval. "That's what I thought," he said, turning to the rest of the group. "You don't mess with the old guard. Not when they've earned the right to be respected." George stood there for a moment, taking in the sight of the young men who had once laughed at him, now standing quietly before him, humbled. It was a strange feeling, being the one with the power, the one with the voice. But he knew this was right. This wasn't about proving something to them. It was about reminding himself who he was. Without another word, the bikers turned and started to leave. As they rode off, the sound of their engines gradually faded, but the quiet after the storm felt comforting. George stood tall, his heart still pounding, but this time it wasn't out of fear. It was out of a sense of pride, of victory. He'd done it. He had reclaimed his respect. The streets were quiet again. The only sound now, the gentle hum of the wind in the trees and the soft footsteps of George as he made his way back to his house. He stood at the end of the street, looking over the place that had been his home for so many years. The sky was darkening, but George felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in ages. Jack's voice echoed in his mind, "You've earned respect." And it was true. For the first time in a long while, George realized just how much he had earned. Not just as a veteran, but as a person. A man who had lived through hard times, loved deeply, and fought for what was right. And now, in his later years, it was time to remind the world of that. As he walked back into his house, George's hand brushed against the leather jacket that still hung from his shoulders. It felt good to wear it, to know that it was more than just a symbol of the past. It was a reminder of everything he had overcome. The phone rang as soon as George closed the door behind him. He picked it up without hesitation. "Hey, old man." Jack's voice came through, full of warmth. "How's it feel?" George couldn't help but smile. "It feels good, better than I thought." Jack laughed. "Told you, didn't I? You're not alone in this world. You've got people who will always have your back." George sat down in his favorite chair, the one he'd spent so many years in, and for the first time in a long time he didn't feel alone. The room felt warmer, as if the walls themselves were offering a quiet, welcoming embrace. He wasn't the old man on the corner anymore. He was someone who had stood up for himself and had earned the respect of those who mattered. As the evening stretched on, George felt a calm that filled his heart, a peace that hadn't been there before. The next morning, when he went for his walk again, he noticed something different. People smiled at him. People waved at him. The same street that had once seemed so cold and distant now felt like home, surrounded by respect and kindness. George didn't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. He knew his worth, and from now on, he'd walk with his head held high, no longer the victim of mockery, but a man who had lived, fought, and earned his place in the world. And that, he thought, was all he ever needed. Thank you so much for watching this story. I hope it touched you as much as it touched me. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and let me know what you think about this story. And if you want to see more heartfelt, dramatic tales like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an update. Your support means the world, and it helps me bring more content like this to you. Thanks again for being a part of this journey.